Hi, I'd like to. Previously, I did a discussion about the second chapter of this book, David Benatar's "Never Better Never to Have Been: The Harm of Coming into Existence." The second chapter is the first one is more of a introduction. The second one is actually just saying why existing is a harm, and I looked at that and I discussed it on a video, which you'll find right there. That I reasons why I found that was agreeable, or why I agreed with that. And I actually did agree with that. I actually agreed with some things that a antinatalist said, which is not typical for me, as I'm not myself a antinatalist. I mean, that's not that's not how I that's not how I think. I mean, I am myself a theist, where I believe in an actual God, and the whole thing with this is that if you that is where your belief on the antinatalism issue is if you have some kind of God, then it's likely that you are not a antinatalist, and you are not going to be. It just is not possible. But I'm actually reading this stuff. I read the second and third chapter, and I've agreed with both of them. But I'm gonna discuss the third one right now. The third one is the badness of coming into existence, or how harmful it actually is. How harmful it is to really exist. I want to find the front. How bad is coming into existence? And he starts with a little quote from Arthur Schopenhauer. You may look upon life as a unprofitable episode, disturbing the blessed calm of non-existence. And he also has a quote from George Santayana: "The fact of having been born is a very bad augury for immortality." So, essentially, what he's saying here is that in his second chapter, he's talked about why existence is a harm. He's showing that there is some bad in everyone's life. In everyone's life, there's going to be some kind of negativity or badness. There's just really no way out of it, and he discusses, like, he's really arguing against the optimists a lot here, because what those people do, the optimists, what they do is they're going to argue by means of saying, well, you have the potential to be happy. You have the possibility of actually being happy, and it's not, it's not just totally the way it is for you. There's ways that you can become happy, and there's ways that you can have pleasure in your life outweigh the bad immensely. But I'm gonna have to disagree with that. I mean, I'm not a antinatalist. I'm not a pessimist, but neither am I a optimist, because I think that the optimist perspective is, at best, a storybook, or a fantasy, I guess, because those kind of and I used to be one of those people who would advocate that kind of idea of life, but that's not how I view that anymore. My actual view of life is that even though I am a Christian and I'm a theist, and I do assume a God, I don't think, at the same time, I don't think that I do not think that life is cake. I do not think that life is absence of suffering, nor do I think that life is a fantasy in storybook. I think that's wrong. So I guess the reason I'm reading this book by a antinatalist, because I want to see why he thinks, and why the whole antinatalist population thinks that we should, no longer procreate, and no longer have children, which would because of them that actually causes more suffering. And there's plenty of antinatalists on YouTube. There's plenty of them. There's Derived Energy. There's Gary, of course. There's many. There's actually many of them out there, and I guess I'm surprised at how many people who are on YouTube that are, for one, atheist or agnostic, antinatalist, nihilist about morality as well as other things. I'm just surprised at how many people are on here on YouTube that have negative philosophies, but that's a totally different idea. But I'm going to jump into this here. For his first little section in this chapter is why life's quality is not the difference between good and bad. All right. Well, where was I at here? Okay. Pretty much what I was discussing is the fact that David Benatar, in his second chapter, he talks about how life is there's harm in just existing because of the badness that is there, and he argued in the previous chapter that is a harm to exist. Now in this one he has a little section in the third chapter, why life's quality is not the difference between bad and good. And he says this because in the previous chapter he was talking about the asymmetry between pleasure and pain, the fact that and he has this little figure, if I can find it, it's figure 2-4. It's this figure here, if you can see that. Essentially what the optimist idea is to take number 2 in this and take number 1 and then subtract the value of number 2 from the value of number 1, and then you would have the the net value of the quality of your life. But he says that because of the asymmetry and as well as other things, that's not exactly how it is, because for one thing, badness is something that is not symmetrical to good. It's not as cut and dry as that, essentially. And he talks about that, and I have a video that you can go to and where I discuss the second chapter more in depth. But here he has 4 little considerations that he has for why life's quality is not just the difference between how much good is there and how much bad is there. The first one is the order of the good and bad. For instance, in a life in which all good occurred in the first half and uninterrupted bad characterizes the second half, would be a lot worse than one in which good and bad were more evenly distributed. So if we have a pretty long life here, and we have a lot of bad in the beginning, or if we have a certain kind of, based on the order of good and bad within the life, that can determine the quality of life more than just how much of each one is there. Another one would be, and the first 3 of these here are what he calls distributional considerations, because they are concerned with how the good and the bad are distributed through life. And the second one is the intensity of the good and the bad. A life in which pleasures were extraordinarily intense, but correspondingly few, if frequent and short-lived, might be worse than a life with the same total amount of pleasure, but where the individual pleasures were less intense and more frequently distributed across the life. Now, if pleasures and other goods can be also distributed too widely within a life, thereby making them so mild as to be barely distinguishable from neutral states, a life so characterized might be worse than one in which there were so few. There are a few more noticeable highs. So that's also another one. You can think about I guess when I think about the intensity of pleasures being discussed in philosophy, I think about Epicurus, because he says that, for instance, that we should not just take every single small pleasure that there is, because we have to, that we should probably, wait for, or wait for, wait maybe and take some pain to get more intense and better pleasures. But that's just that's that's what I think about when I think about intensity, and I would think that intensity would make a difference rather than how much good and how much bad is there in one life. The third one is the length of life. To be sure, the length of a life will interact dynamically with the quantity of good and bad. A long life with very little good would have to be characterized by significant quantities of bad, if only because the absence of sufficient good over such long periods would create tedium, a bad. Nevertheless, we can imagine lives of somewhat unequal length that share the same quantity of good and bad. One life might have more neutral features sufficiently evenly distributed over the life not to affect the quantity of good or bad. In such cases, one might plausibly judge the longer life to be better, if the life is of sufficient quality to be worth continuing, or worse if it is not. So, in these distributional considerations, we have the order of the good and bad, the intensity of the good and bad, as well as the length of the life itself. Those things alone are going to make a difference rather than just the quantity of good and bad, which essentially means, given those three things alone, you cannot take just these figures here and try and subtract 2 from 1 and just have some kind of quantity here. You just can't really do that. You can do that, and you can see how much, see what you come up with. That isn't the last straw on what life's quality is, on what a certain life's quality is. All right, that's one thing that he says, and I find this to be quite convincing, because it's not. I don't find it that it's a quantity of life in good and bad as much as it is what exactly those things are, and how those things affect you. But keeping all this, in all this stuff, it should be kept in mind that he argued the fact that sorry, I keep stopping and then coming back. I apologize for that. But there's one more thing on the three distributional considerations that I was discussing before I cut out. There's a fourth one which is not itself distributional. There's a further consideration that can affect an assessment of a life's quality. Arguably, once life reaches a certain threshold of badness, considering both the amount and the distribution of its badness, no quantity of good can outweigh it, because no amount of good could be worth that badness. It is just this assessment that Donald Cowart made of his own life, or at least that part of his life, following a gas explosion that burned 2/3 of his body. He refused extremely painful, life-saving treatment, but the doctors ignored his wishes and treated him nonetheless. His life was saved. He achieved considerable success, and he retained a satisfactory quality of life. Yet he continued to maintain these post-burn goods were not worth the cost of enduring the treatments to which he was subjected. No matter how much good followed his recovery, this could not outweigh, at least in his own assessment, the bad of the burns and treatment that he experienced. So yeah, that's basically the whole thing here, is the threshold of badness. He had that gas, the whole gas explosion, and then he had the whole procedure that he didn't even want to help save his life, but he didn't even want that. But the whole thing was it was really painful for him, and therefore, because of that, he did not find that to make the rest of his life worthwhile, even though he did achieve a certain amount of success after the whole treatment. So that's one thing there. And then Benatar continues. This point may be expressed more generally. Compare two lives, those of X and Y, and consider for simplicity's sake only the amount of good and bad, and not also the distributional considerations. X's life has relatively modest quantities of good and bad, perhaps 15 kilo units. I like how he does these little kilo unit things. Perhaps 15 kilo units of positive value and 5 kilo units of negative value. Y's life, by contrast, has unbearable quantities of bad, say 50 kilo units of negative value. Y's life also has much more good, 70 kilo units of positive value, and than does X's. Nevertheless, X's life might be reasonably judged to be less bad, even if Y's has greater net value, judged in strictly quantitative terms. 10 kilo units versus 20 kilo units of positive value. This shows further why the assignment of values in Figure 2.4, the one I was showing you earlier, in the previous chapter, must as I argued, that be wrong. From the foregoing reflection, it should be apparent that an assessment of how bad a life is must be more complicated than simply subtracting the good from the bad. It will not do, therefore, to attempt to calculate how bad a life is simply by subtracting the value of quadrant 2 from the value of quadrant 1. And we're talking about, again, this one here, this little quadrant here. We're taking the subtracting the value of quadrant 2 from quadrant 1, and he's battling against this whole idea that it's so simple to figure out life's quality. When he discussed that whole the whole threshold of badness, where, and I guess I want to make a little remark about the whole threshold of badness. If we have the X life, let me go back to that. And X life has 15 kilo units of positive value and 5 kilo units of negative value. Y's life has 70 kilo units of positive value and 50 kilo units of negative value. And it's Benatar says X's life might reasonably be judged less bad. Now, I guess think about that. Like, I'm gonna have to agree with that at points. That even though Y's life has so much more good in it, but there's so much more bad in it at the same time. And this goes back to the whole asymmetry of pleasure and pain, because they're not symmetrical. So the idea of pain and badness is not so easily canceled out by higher amounts of good, or equal amounts of good either. So there's these 4 considerations that show even further beyond the whole asymmetry claims in Chapter 2 why the whole quadrant subtraction thing, the whole optimism idea, is not so good to do. It's not so simple. And then he has a section now, which is called why self-assessments of one life's quality are unreliable. So here he has a few different psychological phenomena. He's going into some psychology here, which are basically distortions of what the reality is. Here he says most people deny that their lives, all things considered, are bad, and they certainly deny that their lives are so bad as to make never existing preferable. Indeed, most people think that their lives go quite well. Such widespread blithe self-assessments of well-being, it is often thought, constitute a refutation of the view that the life is bad. How, it is asked, can life be bad if most of those who live it deny that it is? How can it be a harm to come into existence if most of those who have come into existence are pleased that they did? In fact, however, this is a very good reason to doubt that these self-assessments are a reliable indicator of life's quality. There are a number of well-known features of human psychology that can account for the favorable assessment of people usually make of their own life's quality. It is these psychological phenomena rather than the actual quality of life that explain the extent of the positive assessment. Now, first of all, I think it's very important to say. You can think about the whole idea that people have a distorted idea of how good or bad their life is. If they have a good distortion of how good their life is, doesn't that mean that we shouldn't have to go through all this? And I would say probably not, because we have these different, ideas, but they're mostly adaptations that people make throughout their lives often because of how bad that is, or how bad some things are. Now, the first one is the Pollyanna principle. This is the tendency towards optimism. This manifests in many ways. First, there is an inclination to recall positive rather than negative experiences. For example, when asked to recall events from throughout their lives, subjects in a number of studies listed a much greater number of positive than negative experiences. This selective recall distorts our judgment of how well our lives have gone so far. It is not only assessments of our past that are biased, but also our projections or expectations about the future. We tend to have an exaggerated view of how good things will be. The Pollyannaism typical of recall and projection is also characteristic of subjective judgments about current and overall well-being. Many studies have consistently shown that self-assessments of well-being are markedly skewed toward the positive end of the spectrum. Okay, so we're thinking about here of a psychological phenomenon that will make you think that things are better than they really are. Now, that's one thing to think about. There are a couple more here. Another well-known psychological phenomenon that makes our self-assessment of well-being unreliable, and that explains some of the Pollyannaism just mentioned in a phenomenon of what might be called adaptation, accommodation, or habituation. When a person's objective well-being takes a turn for the worse, there is at first a significant subjective dissatisfaction. However, there's a tendency to then adapt to the new situation and to adjust to one's expectations accordingly. Although there is some dispute about how much adaptation occurs and how the extent of the adaptation varies in different domains of life, there is agreement that adaptation does occur. As a result, even if the subjective sense of well-being does not return to the original level, it comes closer towards it than one might think, and it comes closer in some domains than in others. Because the subjective sense of well-being tracks a recent change in the level of well-being better than it tracks a person's actual level of well-being, it is an unreliable indicator of the latter. So, first of all, we have adaptation. This one is adaptation, accommodation, or habituation. Now, this is sort of this is often a term for the worse. It's like the other way around, but it's kind of the Pollyannaism also. But when a person's objective well-being takes a turn for the worse, there is a significant subjective dissatisfaction. However, is there a tendency to adapt to the new situation and to adjust one's expectations accordingly. And then there's dispute about how much adaptation occurs and how the extent of the adaptation varies in different domains of life. There is agreement that this does occur. So we're talking, for the most part, adaptation to certain things, and then there's disputes on how it works. But this is a lot of the time due to decreases in in the well-being of people. Now the third one is a third psychological factor that affects self-assessments of well-being is an implicit comparison with the well-being of others. It is not so much how well one's life goes as how well it goes in comparison with others that determines one's judgment about how well one's life is going. Thus, self-assessments are a better indicator of the comparative rather than the actual quality of one's life. One effect of this is that those negative features of life that are shared by everyone are entered in people's judgments about their own well-being. Since these features are very relevant, overlooking them leads to unreliable judgments. Of these, and then he kind of discusses these three further. Of these three psychological phenomena, it is only Pollyannaism that inclines people unequivocally towards more positive assessments on how well their life is going. We adapt not only to negative situations but also to positive ones. And I guess first of all we have the Pollyannaism. I guess my question here is, if we have if we have a distortion on how well our life is going, why do we have to think about this? Why do we have to think about antinatalism? Why do we have to think about any of this? And I guess the reason is that we're gonna have. I'm gonna guess that this happens because the whole Pollyannaism is gonna raise your idea when your actual well-being is lower. It's not as It's like actually quite lower. So I'm gonna guess that when these things happen that makes your well-being low, you're gonna feel that, and you're gonna feel and have in your real well-being what those bad things are. And Pollyannaism, which is gonna a psychological phenomenon that will distort your self assessment of well-being, that will not make those things go away. So I'm going to say that it might make things better, but it's not going to make the things that make your self-assessment of well-being go low any different or better. And then the other two are going to distort it also. And I'm thinking the whole implicit comparison is going to make that much more distorted, because that's just totally, we're talking about people who look at others and certain negative things there. But Pollyannism is really the one that will make it go up rather than down. And after this, he has these three different ideas of life. Three views about the quality of life and why life goes badly on all of them. Now, these three are the objective list, hedonistic, and desire fulfillment. Now, if you know any kind of ethics, you're going to know what hedonism and desire for fulfillment is. Moral value theory has hedonism and desire for fulfillment in its little moral theories of value, and hedonism is essentially the moral theories of value that have the value in certain pleasurable and pleasant states. That's really what hedonism is, and then desire for fulfillment is just what it is. It's value based upon certain desires being fulfilled, regardless of whether the state is pleasant or not. And then the whole objective list, that's something I'll discuss too. In influential taxonomy, that distinguishes three kinds of theory about the quality of life. According to hedonistic theories, life goes well or badly depending on the extent to which it is positive or negative mental states. Let me find the objective list one. Obviously, objective list theories could differ from one another on the basis of the goods and the bads on their lists. One author, and that's James Griffin, suggests that the goods include accomplishments, the components of human existence, including agency, basic capabilities, and liberty, understanding, enjoyment, and deep personal relations. Another author lists possible candidate goods as moral goodness, rational activity, and the development of one's abilities, having children and being a good parent, knowledge, and the awareness of true beauty. On objective list theories, some things are good for us, irrespective of whether they bring pleasure in any given situation, and irrespective of whether we desire them. Other things are bad for us, whether or not they bring pain and whether or not we desire them. The hedonistic theories. We have three kinds of mental states, of course. The pleasurable states, the negative states, are positive, negative, and neutral. And we also differentiate between the intrinsic pleasurable states and the absence of pain states. Now, let's say that you are really, really hungry, and you've been hungry for hours, and you've been working, and you're starving, and you just have not had a chance to eat. The real problem here is that you are in a certain kind of state of discomfort, and once you actually eat something and your belly is full, then you are in a state where the absence of that pain is itself a pleasurable state. And then you have that, and then you have the intrinsic pleasure, where it's not absence of pain that actually makes you feel pleasure, but it's actually the fact that state is pleasurable. And of course, we tend not to think of how much our lives are marked by these states. The three psychological phenomena outlined in the previous section explain why this is so. Because of Pollyannism, we overlook the bad, especially the relatively mildly bad. Adaptation also plays a role. People are so used to the discomforts of daily life that they overlook them entirely, even though they are so pervasive. Finally, since these discomforts are experienced by everyone else too, they do not serve to differentiate the quality of one's own life from the quality of the lives of others. The result is that the normal discomforts are not detected on the radar of subjective assessment of well-being. That we do not think of how much of our daily lives are pervaded by the discomforts of the mentioned, does not mean that our daily lives are not pervaded by them. This this whole idea of hedonism, he's what Benatar is really trying to do here is he's trying to say that when somebody has a hedonistic idea of quality of life, that you're going to have so many different either states of discomfort, or absence of pleasure in your, like a state of discomfort, or anything like that, where you have to go to the bathroom, or you're hungry, you're thirsty, or any kind of discomfort. That itself is also, it's not a neutral state, is it? No, it's not. We have most times in our day, and everyone's day, are not neutral states at all. Most of the time, I think they are negative states, because we're actually discomforted or not happy with something, and we're trying to, fix that. And then pleasures do come from the absence of those pains and discomforts, and also from the intrinsic pleasure. So what Benatar states in this whole idea of the fact that we are mostly in negative states, and not even neutral states, is that even in this idea of hedonism, where the hedonist is looking for pleasurable states, you still are going to see that there's more bad in that. There's more exponential badness in this whole idea, even though you're looking at it from the hedonistic standpoint. So then he goes on to a different standpoint called which is the desire for fulfillment theories. Now, this again can be looked at in a similar way, because hedonism and desire for fulfillment are two quite similar ideas. Desire for fulfillment is, of course, your desire being fulfilled, and that is how you get a pleasant state. That is how you get that. But what happens, though, is that our desires are not really fulfilled. They are not, that's just not how the world works, and that is going to cause, for the desire for fulfillment person who's thinking this way, it's going to cause negative states, of course, because all the person's desires are not being fulfilled, of course. So essentially, you have unfulfilled desires causing not even neutral states. So therefore it comes out bad that way too. And then we have the objective list state, which I need to explain better. Now, I could go on for a long time. I'm like 25 minutes in this video, and I got probably like half an hour right now. So I'm gonna discuss this, and then that's gonna get close to ending the chapter. So I can keep going on and on, but I'm gonna be short with this, as short as I possibly could be. Okay, objective list theories. The discussions of hedonistic and desire for fulfillment views applies also to objective list views. Pleasurable mental states and the absence of painful ones must be on the list of objective goods. So basically what we're talking about is, like, how some people have theories of moral objective goods, or objective morals that are independent of the self, and that we should be looking at. Plato had this idea of objective forms and things like that. These are objective beings. So these are lists of goods being referred to as outside of the self, mostly. Similarly, the list of objective goods must include the fulfillment of some desires. Moreover, just as our desires adapt to our circumstances and are formulated by comparing ourselves with others, so objective lists of life's goods are constructed in a way that makes it possible for at least some people to be said to flourish. That is to say, objective lists of goods are not constructed sub specie aeternitatis, for from a truly objective perspective. Instead, they are constructed subspecies humanitatis, from a human perspective. So, I guess we would have to actually do some work to figure out what that objective list of goods would be, but they would involve some fulfillment of desires, as Benatar says, and also it would come by some kind of pleasurable mental state at some point, whether it's the intrinsic one or the absence of pain one. Either way, he says that even with this one, you're gonna have lack of neutral or pleasurable states. You're gonna have a state of discomfort, thus negative goods. And he says that with these three, you don't see anything different. If you assess life's quality through any of these lenses, you're not gonna find anything different other than the fact that most of your life states, of your life quality states, are going to end up with the most negative values, the negative state values. So essentially from that, he has a little section called the world of suffering. And the world of suffering, this little one he has here, it's just basically a kind of a conclusion to the chapter, where he talks about how many people suffer, how many people die from all these different things. He basically, there's so many stats in this one section of this chapter. I mean, for instance, like, he has a very strong sentence that actually begins the section. Such is the strength of Pollyannaism, that the foregoing sort of pessimism is often dismissed as the self-pitying wing of existential weaklings. So basically, what he's saying there is that Pollyannaism is so strong that pessimism and the current thing that he is advocating is dismissed as self-pitying winging of existential weaklings. So, yeah, which is really kind of what happens here. That's what they're doing a lot, is they're dismissing the antinatalists as people who are weak and can't get their life together, which is not. We can't dismiss this so easily. It's not something that we can dismiss. And when he puts so many stats in here, you can't look at those stats and be like, oh, this is a shitty theory. You can't just do that. For instance, he talks about how in the last few years, flooding, for example, has killed an estimated 20,000 annually, and brought suffering to tens of millions. Let me find another one. Millions of people obviously are killed during wars. According to the World Report on Violence and Health, there were 1.6 million conflict-related deaths in the 16th century, 6.1 million in the 17th century, 7 million in the 18th century, 19.4 million in the 19th, and 109.7 million in that most bloody centuries, the 20th. So he's discussing all this stuff, and if you read that section, you're going to see how much there really is that's there, how much suffering and death and all that stuff is into this world, and mostly from this one section in the chapter, you can mostly say from there that life doesn't go without suffering. It just doesn't happen. There's going to be not only will there be discomfort that leads to negative mental states, but there's going to be so much incredibly excruciatingly painful deaths and disasters, and all these things are just so overwhelmingly negative on everyone. And if I didn't know better, I'm going to explain why. Because the next chapter in this book that I'm going to read is called "Having Children: The Antenatal View," or something like that. If I didn't know better, I would be joining this camp. I would. If I didn't know better, I'd be a antinatalist right now. I would, because if I didn't believe in a certain higher power, then first of all, according to Bertrand Russell, if you don't assume a God, the question of life's purpose is meaningless. Therefore, if people who don't assume gods see no purpose in life, and thus look at all the stuff that people like David Benatar are putting in this book, like in the World of Suffering section of chapter 3, and they look at all that stuff and they're like, well, what the hell is all this for? I mean, why all the suffering? Why? I mean, why are we here? And then but at the same time that they're still gonna ask the question of why we're here. Why all the suffering? Why? But that's a whole different deal, though. So yeah, I'm gonna read the next chapter. The first two that I've done, chapter 2 and 3, I have agreed with. I have. Most of it anyway, because in the second and third chapter he has not said anything about the antenatal perspective of why we should be stopping procreation. So I don't know. I'll read that chapter and then I'll be back.